to episode 2 of the KD Recruitment Revolution podcast. I am delighted to be joined today by Neil Carberry, who's the Chief Executive of the Recruitment and Employment Confederation. Neil's been in position with the REC since 2018, is that right?
Yep, absolutely.
Yep, and I think you've probably got about 25 years worth of experience in recruitment, so you do know your stuff.
Yeah, I started in recruitment in the last century, is how I like to say to people. Although I did have a big diversion into industrial relations and kind of broader HR stuff for a while. But yeah, I have been at the REC for 6 years now. So that's one pandemic or about 5 prime ministers.
Yes, I was going to say I've lost count of how many prime ministers we've had in those last 6 years. I think I've had more hot dinners.
Exactly. Well, maybe we'll go on to talk about maybe a bit more stability for the next few years.
Absolutely. So episode 2, we wanted to focus on the election and what that means for the recruitment industry and all of our clients. So I know that you've been doing a lot of work in the background for REC members and also looking at what the government, the outgoing government and then the incoming government and what their plans were. So I thought it would be good for you and I to basically go through kind of some of the key points that the Labour Manifesto has alluded to that they're wanting to do, what they're wanting to do within the first 100 days in government, and then also what that means moving forward. So I think the first thing we need to do is talk about their plan to make work pay, which is not easy to say. It is a bit of a tongue twister. But for those of the listeners and those watching that don't know what that is, they've said that they want to introduce this plan within the first 100 days, don't they? And there are key points within this plan that they want to cover. So I think it would be good for us to talk about some of those key points. So I think one of the first ones is the day one rights. So I think they're looking at bringing in day one rights for any worker other than, well, it's including gig workers and self-employed, so it's anybody working. And it's bringing in day one rights for parental leave, sick pay, and also the unfair dismissal claims as well, which at the moment I think previously had been sort of from 2 years, but they're wanting to bring this in from day one rights. How do we feel about the implications of this at the moment then?
So a couple of things. It's worth remembering that the Plan to Make Work Pay is a version of their New Deal for Workers, which was launched back in 2021. And if you think about party conference time back in 2021, that was a Labour Party that was behind in the polls. It was a Labour Party that was just about 18 months on from pretty much a kicking in the 2019 general election. And everything with this government we have to understand is shaped by the fact that they've basically gone from 1983, their worst defeat in ages, to 1997, their glorious victory in one parliamentary term. So everything's moved fast. What does that mean? It means that the practicalities of a lot of this have not had the 5-10 years of kicking about that other oppositions have had. And I think you see that in the day one rights proposal. Now, there's some things here, kind of day one right to some of the flexible stuff. I think lots of companies are doing that already. Unfair dismissal is a really interesting one because, of course, it's become a bit of a political football. There are in the US, there's a kind of a set of executive orders that Republican presidents sign when they arrive in office that overturn a load of stuff that all Democratic presidents do, and vice versa when a Democratic president takes over. Unfair dismissal appears to be the British version of that because the UD qualifying period until 2010-11 was 1 year. And then the Conservatives put it up to 2 years under the coalition government, and now Labour's talking about taking it away completely. I think the UD point is a really clear illustration of where the challenges lie with the Plan to Make Work Pay, in as much as in principle, dismissing someone fairly sounds great. But if you apply unfair dismissal to a small employer with someone who's joined 2, 3, 4 weeks ago, who, 2, 3 weeks in, this person just patently isn't the right person for the job, then you as a small employer are now bound into following the ACAS code to dismiss them. There's a load of process. And Labour has quite blithely said, we're not getting rid of probation periods. They've yet to explain that. So it's a great example of how when Labour says we're going to take action in the first 100 days, what they don't mean is that the common commencement date in October will have a load of employment laws in it that we'll need to adopt. What they mean is we're going to start doing stuff in the first 100 days. There will be an employment bill in the King's Speech on the 17th of July. But I think there's a lot of practicality to push into that. A lot of these, I think we know the kind of the general direction of travel without knowing how we get there on a lot of this now. And actually the pressure that we and lots of business voices are putting on the government is, okay, let's work out how we do this now.
Yeah.
And that will take time.
And I think the challenge is going to be for those who are on interim contracts and the small employers who don't understand the unfair dismissal from day one. If it does go through, will they reduce the amount of interim contracts or self-employed people that they hire for fear of doing it wrong? Whereas at the moment, you can bring people in and make a decision pretty quickly, A, that they're not working, or B, it's a short-term contract, I now don't need you anymore. You finish the work sooner than planned, off you pop. And I think that for me is something that in the SME market, which is kind of a lot of our clients, they're going to struggle to understand because they don't necessarily have HR, and it's going to be a big change for them.
Well, and I think it's interesting from the point of view of Labour's commitment to thinking about kind of the substantive workforce and the terms and conditions that you might want workers to operate under, and we'll go on and talk about the 0 hours commitments they've made. But I mean, I think there's a bit of an incentive for smaller employers to lean towards temp here.
Yeah.
Because you're insuring yourself from the employment relationship with someone who you don't, it might be a bit of a feed into more temp to perm style hiring.
Yeah.
I think, talking our book as the industry, obviously that's potentially a good thing for the industry. I'm not sure you want regulation to be driving employer behaviours like that, though. So one of the things is just making sure that whatever we do on things like probation periods feels practical, and that we understand that the employment tribunal system and the risk of an employment tribunal claim is a very significant risk to smaller employers, where particularly if you've got family businesses often run by a married couple or something like that. If you have an ET claim, that can go on for 18 months, 2 years. It can draw you completely away from your business and damage the business and the careers of the people who work in the business. So I think, it is one thing to open up day one rights, and I think we should all be open to discussing what the right balance of rights is, but making sure it's practical, and then actually making sure that when it's enforced in a sensible way. Because we talked before that one of the big things for me is what you do with this single enforcement body that's in the plan. Because I think lots of employers would say that the challenge in this country is that government likes to pass lots of legislation for compliant employers to comply with, and then not properly enforce against non-compliant employers. And that does need to change.
No, absolutely. And I think and we can probably talk about the single enforcement body that they're going to bring in then. And they want to make sure that employment rights are upheld. It's going to involve trade unions, TUC representation. It's going to look at things like the health and safety, minimum wage, exploitation and discrimination. So how do you feel about having it all in kind of one place? For me, I think it's potentially a good thing as long as the government are actually listening to the trade unions and the business world and the recruitment world to make sure that they get this right.
Yeah, I think that it's one of those ones where like a lot of this, actually, Labour needs an institutional framework with businesses and trade unions to make it work, and they need to move quickly to to build that, especially in their own position as an employer, because one of the things about Labour governments is that Secretary of State's come to realise pretty quickly that they're actually the employer on this other side of the table, from the teaching unions, from the health unions, from the rail unions, and there's a different dynamic there to the one that maybe they're used to in opposition. I think when you think about the single enforcement body, you mention kind of businesses and unions. I think Paul Novak and the TUC and I see this the same way, which is there's clearly a case for much better joined up enforcement. We know that non-compliance on all sorts of things layers on top of each other. We know that NMW compliance has been done by HMRC. It's not HMRC's core competency, although the team has been invested in. The two big risks are, one, when you merge public sector bodies, you tend to get a bit of a bun fight and a struggle for control. You see that in some of the briefing that's gone in from enforcement bodies in the last week to new ministers, which is largely, dear Secretary of State, here's why you should increase our powers and ask us to do more stuff so we can justify our existence, which is both depressing and inevitable, frankly. But the other bit is that there are really skilled people in the enforcement bodies that you wouldn't want to lose. So from my perspective, if you look at the Employment Agency Standards Inspectorate, they are relatively small by comparison to HMRC's NMW enforcement or some of the other enforcement bodies that might be merged in, but they are employment business specialists.
Yeah.
And we would need to keep that in order to make sure that we're well regulated. We saw what can happen last year with another enforcement body who actually fundamentally misread recruitment law and had to be corrected by the REC and others. We need that level of specialism. So with a single enforcement body, it's merge it slowly and work on how you increase capacity, because the unions worry, not unreasonably, is actually what you do is you tot all the budgets together for the enforcement bodies that you've merged, and then you cut the budget. Yeah. Because there are economies of scale. I think we need to be really careful about what we're actually asking this body to do.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think the union's going to play a key part in this. And I think it's then trying to make sure that both the public sector and the private sector are represented properly. And I think, you've mentioned sort of about the national minimum wage in there as well. And one of the things that sort of come out of Labour taking over, especially with the minimum wage, is things like they want to get rid of the bandings and they want to have a living wage for all adults as well, don't they? Yes. Which in the current climate and cost of living, absolutely understand. I think the challenge is in our region, there's a lot of deprivation, and the current increase this year has had a massive impact on a lot of our clients' bottom line. We've got a lot of people who are working at that next level up, that 25 to 27K level. So to have their minimum wage increase last year, this year, quite substantial. That next level, that gap has been getting smaller. So we've had to do a lot of work with businesses in the area around salary reviews, salary benchmarking. Yeah. And they've had to do full reviews of every level within the business, which has affected the bottom line. But productivity has not increased. Headcount hasn't increased, but payroll has gone up exponentially. And I think there's going to be a lot of people thinking about, increasing it again, but then not having the bandings in there for the businesses to go, well, even if I wanted to grow headcount, I now can't afford it because I couldn't afford it this year. And if they do it again next year, it is a challenge with the SME market, and areas like in North Yorkshire and East Yorkshire, where we've got a lot of deprivation, those salaries aren't as high as what they are elsewhere in the country. Yeah. And I think, I agree from an employee perspective, it's good, but from an employer perspective, it's going to be another challenge.
Yeah, I think we're at a bit of an inflection point when it comes to minimum wage, I actually think there's not a lot of pressure on Labour over the rate because we've had these two 10% rises, and I, like you, felt that the second 10% rise. I mean, I'm an ex-low pay commissioner, and I don't think you can criticise the LPC for making the decision it did this year, largely because that 10% rise was the only answer it could give the question that government had set it. The question government set it was, how do we get to 66% of median earnings as the minimum wage by 2024? The answer is a second 10% rise. But I absolutely see what you say. The amount of pain it's driven in companies, and some of those differential effects, because a lot of companies like to have their base rate at 50p above the minimum wage. And then, of course, you've got supervisor rates, which are now not as far as ahead. And you want to reward people for development. And that's very difficult, especially in the context of if someone's on kind of in-work benefits, the rate at which their benefits are taken away. Direction of travel-wise, I think there are one or two things to watch out for. I think it is very likely that the national minimum wage will move to be an 18+ rate rather than a 21+ rate. As businesses, I wonder whether that's not a bad deal for us, because the base you might want the minimum wage to be set against is all adult workers 18 to 65 rather than 21 to 65-year-olds, because 66% of 18 to 65-year-olds is actually less than 66% of 21 to 25-year-olds, 21 to 65-year-olds. I don't yet see any case for abolishing the 16 and 17-year-old rate, largely because the 16 and 17-year-old rate exists to protect young people who have left school with no qualifications at all, who we just need to get into a workplace, because that we know that is what works. So I would expect the LPC to be given a steer to keep the minimum wage at 66% of median earnings next year, but that will ultimately end up in a lower rise. I think Labour is very much more focused on conditions. So the whole piece, it's very interesting. The Living Wage Foundation has moved towards a living hours approach. So thinking about hours, and this is where the whole 0 hours contracts thing comes from. It's
so we can come on to that.
Stability of predicted income feels more important to them than the actual minimum wage rate. And if you think about the fact that the minimum wage has gone up by 20% over 2 years, that's not a surprise, really.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. And don't get me wrong, I think it absolutely is needed when you think of how much the cost of housing and, renting or buying properties and things like that, how much that's gone up, and the wages haven't gone up enough for people to then be able to buy those properties or rent those properties. So I think I agree that Labour are probably doing the right thing with what you're saying. I think it's just a challenge at the moment when a lot of the businesses are struggling with increase of productivity and increasing orders, and they're having to then increase their prices, and they're kind of the main challenges. I think it sort of segues nicely what you said about the 0 hour contracts. So let's talk about that. So in our region, we are heavily seasonal. And we have a lot of sectors that use 0 hour contracts very well. And a lot of people who want to work on 0 hour contracts because they've got caring responsibilities, or they might be students, or they might have disabilities or illnesses that mean that they can't do full-time work or set hours and things like that. So I think we can have a full debate on 0 hour contracts, but actually the first thing to do is probably understand what Labour means. So they changed their wording from banning all 0 hour contracts to now banning exploitative 0 hour contracts. So what do they mean, do we think, by the exploitative term?
So what they've done is move away, and this is this whole 1983 to 1987 one bound thing. They've moved from 0 hour contracts are bad, we're going to ban them, which incidentally Tony Blair said before the 97 general election as well, to the language which is used by the Trade Union Congress, which is we're going to ban exploitative zero hours contracts. That's driven by the fact that there are a load of people in unions like BEC2 who are broadcast engineers and quite like being freelancers. Thank you very much. So there's something here about the necessity of telling the new government, and we can go on to discuss this in terms of our Voice of the Workers campaign, the way the labour market really is, rather than the kind of the perception that maybe politicians have if they haven't worked in business, but also kind of if they exist in the Whitehall Westminster think tank world. I suspect that when you get into that detail, suddenly you look at zero hours contracts a different way. So that the government appears to be picking up an idea that came out of the Low Pay Commission must be about 5 years ago now. So slightly I'm guilty because I was on the commission that wrote it. But we were asked after Matthew Taylor's Good Work review to look at the idea of a higher minimum wage for people whose hours are not guaranteed. And the commission took the view that that was complex and difficult and also not very justified. Minimum wage is a minimum wage. And instead we went down the route of saying, surely the principle is if people have a stable working week, their contract should reflect that.
Yeah. So
the commission went down the route of saying, well, take a reference period, 12 weeks is a fairly standard one. Over 12 weeks, if you've worked 35 hours a week in the same pattern of those 12 weeks, you should probably have a right to a contract that says you work 35 hours across that pattern.
Yeah.
And that is where the government is tacking towards. And the justification of saying how does that meet our goal of banishing exploitative zero hours contracts is the people who are protected are those who are on zero hours contracts who are actually working predictable hours. Yeah. And you'll hear this language of one-sided flexibility a lot from the government, where the flexibility is all one-sided. So I, as the employer, are happy to have you work a steady week forever as long as my demand is there, and I'm willing to make no commitment to you, even about what I'll pay you and offer you next week, even though my expectation is that you'll do that 35 hours again. That is a better place to be than something much more sweeping. I think though it also tees up a wider discussion about flexibility and two-sided flexibility, which is just making really clear to this government that a lot of flexibility is driven by workers, not by companies. Because I think I've said to you offline before now, Kelly, I'm absolutely convinced this government sees the value of different forms of work from an economic point of view. I'm yet to be convinced that they see why someone would choose to be a flexible worker rather than work like a civil servant, despite the fact that, for instance, we know the reason loads of nurses work for agencies and not for the NHS is that they can get things from agencies in terms of scheduling that the NHS cannot do for them. Yeah. There's two lessons there. One is the value of agency work. The other is how the NHS needs to develop as an employer. And I think there's a lot of that in the education we've got to do now for the government.
And I think the other side for me on this is there are organisations out there that get people to sign zero-hour contracts that prevent them from working anywhere else, even if they then haven't got any hours that week.
Which are illegal. Yeah,
but you and I both know that there are still people out there flogging that. And the other side are those that are, the workers are en route to the shift. They're on the train, bus, taxi, driving, and then they get the text to go, you're not needed today. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that kind of covers that exploitative side. So I think absolutely that needs reform. I agree with you in the sense of, if somebody is working 35 hours a week on a zero-hour contract and it's never changed, why are you not on a 35-hour week contract? So absolutely, that should be put in place. And I think that's reminiscent of when the government changed how commission and bonuses and things like that were paid, because again it was and the holiday pay and things, it was if you've worked and earned something for a certain period of time and you take time off, your earnings should be based on that previous 12 weeks or that 6 months, or so I think it's reminiscent of similar stories that we've sort of heard before.
Yeah, it is. And so two bits there. One, the point about exclusivity contracts, that's your enforcement discussion that we've already had, which is you've just got to enforce this stuff. And use enforcement bodies to do it rather than employment tribunals. On shift cancellation, actually another part of that LPC recommendation was some form of shift cancellation payment. Now, I always defer to my favourite ice cream manufacturer that I used to work with when I was at the CBI to explain this. So the sun comes out on Wednesday, and and it's going to stick around to Friday, and the phone rings at your ice cream manufacturer with Sainsbury's saying, "No, we'll have triple what we ordered." You've got to have the capacity to upswing to that and to downswing from it if suddenly there's a storm. So shift cancellation is a difficult thing to manage, but if you've committed to having someone coming in and they've got up at 5 a.m. and they're outside your factory gate at 5:45, you've got to be paying them something for that. Yeah. And I think we will see a proposal that does that.
Yeah. And I think this leads us nicely into single worker status, because obviously a lot of organisations, if they're not using 0-hour contracts, they're using temporary staff or shift fluctuations. And I think this is one of the main concerns for the recruitment industry in terms of what they're going to do to change that you are either employed or self-employed, and the term worker is not going to be there anymore. So obviously their original deal was very much about changing it completely. Then they made a move towards a single worker status and transition it, and they said that they were going to transition more into this kind of two-part framework for the employment status, and where you can differentiate between a worker or a self-employed. But interestingly, this wasn't really then mentioned in the manifesto, was it?
Yeah, and they did quite a lot of work before the election on this. And as with all these things, that work suggested that it's incredibly complex.
Yeah.
And I'm a bit of an outlier in terms of kind of labour market thinking in the tripartite work status, because I actually think the law's clear.
Yeah.
And every time it goes to the Employment Appeals Tribunal or the Supreme Court, actually the law seems pretty clear. Go back to the Uber drivers case. I wasn't surprised that the Uber drivers were workers. They were fairly obviously workers, and that's what the court decided. I think a lot of this is about educating people on what the statuses mean.
Yeah.
You're not a worker just because your employer says you're a worker and an employee. And the other thing is about talking with government about what the purpose of worker status is. Because for me, the question we should ask ourselves is, if these people aren't workers, what will they be? And I'm not sure I think almost universally, I'm not sure the answer is employees. They are likely to be something else, whether that is self-employed, false or otherwise, or whether it's some form of contractor relationship. There's a real risk that every time we ramp the law in an unpractical way, we actually increase the commercial benefits of finding a workaround. So one of the things we've been working really hard with the team that is preparing Labour's view on this, and yes, it's not in the manifesto, and that is good, because I don't think you want to make big commitments in this. Ultimately, there will need to be some reform, but I actually kind of come back to the fact that around the world, people are actually looking at our status, because worker status, if you have a gig economy, worker status is actually a really useful thing, because it creates a status where you have a basic floor of rights, even where there's not an ongoing commitment. And that would seem to me to be good for the people in that status, especially when that status includes national minimum wage, holidays, and so forth. So there's there's something there around a deeper discussion to have, and I think Labour have got there on that.
Yeah, and I think that the challenge for the recruitment industry, and then also every business that we supply temporary workers into, there's sort of 1 million people working in temporary jobs on any day in the UK at the moment, and that's the NHS manufacturing, hospitality, it spans across every sector. The challenge will be who is liable for what if they change it. And I know a lot of the businesses that we work with, one of the reasons they use temporary workers is because that's a different pot of money.
Yes.
And, the NHS is a prime example of that. Their pot of money that pays for permanent headcount is fixed. Yet that's not enough people to staff the NHS, and therefore the temporary pot of money is separate. But if you are either employed or self-employed, where does this extra money come from for you to then hire these people when your headcount budgets are as they are? And I know manufacturing businesses who are the same, hotels, just the list goes on. And I think, how do we then as recruiters support our clients in that? Because it's, even with a bit of reform, it's still going to be a challenge for businesses to look at their workforce planning.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that sits over all of this is the primacy of growth and prosperity in the Labour Manifesto, and in many ways that's our strongest suit as businesses, is to say, look, everything that you do should be designed behind how do we encourage investment by the private sector in the UK, grow productivity, kind of reset some of that balance between labour and capital. Our problem in the UK isn't that the robots are coming to take our jobs, is that there aren't enough robots and they aren't taking enough of our jobs. If those things happened, we would have a more productive, higher paid economy, and we'd be creating more jobs for our own people in an environment where our domestic labour force is, of course, already starting to shrink because of the demographics with the baby boomers retiring. So there's a lot here that if you're a business in North Yorkshire, you've got constrained labour supply, you've put up with a period of rising input costs, and input costs rising at a rate that you haven't seen for a long time. Money costs you a lot of money now, by comparison to before. How do you build a case for investment and align, because good employment is delivered by stable employers. Yeah. So there is a little bit of a push here, and I think it's coming from all of the business organisations into, well, what's your institutional framework, Labour, for having a discussion about the industrial strategy? Yeah. For having a discussion about how employment and skills fits into that industrial strategy, and about understanding which policies, how you land good policy with business. And I'd say that there are examples under the previous Labour government where you look at the establishment of the Low Pay Commission and the initial rates of the minimum wage, or you look at automatic enrolment into pensions and things which were introduced into the labour market, which were not easy for employers to adopt, but introduced in ways in which employers could work with the system. Compare and contrast with the apprenticeship levy, which was designed in Whitehall and landed onto employers and has done exactly what employers said it would in 2016, which is reduce the number of 18 to 25-year-olds doing apprenticeships, reduce employer commitment to apprenticeships, and because of that, start to boost NEET numbers in terms of young people who are not in employment, education, or training. So that kind of work with us rather than work on us feels really important. But to your point about businesses, I think there's something for us as businesses to step up here too, and that is about getting engaged. Really interesting that when the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Liz Kendall, announced their employability reforms the week after the election, really focused on local action, really focused on supporting local discussions. There is a real push here on businesses in local areas to step up and to do more strategic planning for their businesses, and I think that's probably the give that we have as a private sector community in return for expecting government to tailor what they're doing to ways we can work with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's a couple of things that you mentioned there is reforming the apprenticeship levy. Well, we've all been shouting about that for years, that needed reform. So it'll be interesting to see what their new skills and growth levy is going to look like and how does that work. So I'm really interested to see what they do with that. You've mentioned about the industrial strategy, and I think, again, they want to centre that around growth, which is really positive, and looking at future workforce development. So the investments that they want to make around development of AI, creating all these data centres, so looking at relaxing their planning laws, the gigafactories for automotive, so we can get that back in the UK and the steel industry, and looking at kind of the green kind of sectors as well. So I think that has got some real positive markers for me. And then you've then kind of touched on the kind of younger generation. We work a lot with schools and colleges in the region. I'm on the board for NIBEP in York, and we go into a lot of these schools and colleges to try and support with careers advice and those touch points to give the students experience of the workplace. And I think it's good to see that Labour are having a focus on this as well. They've said, because at the moment I think it's like 1 in 8 people, young people, who are not in education or employment, which is staggering. And I think in our region as well, we've got a few schools where, you know, the children come from particularly deprived areas and will fall through them cracks because people in their family don't work, there's not enough opportunities and things like that. So one of the things that I was pleased to see is that they've got this youth guarantee so that all young people between 18 and 21 will have access to training and apprenticeship or support to get into work. So that's a real positive. And then they want to increase the work experience so that all young people get access to 2 weeks work experience. And at the current rate, it's not essential. The Gatsby benchmarks are set with the schools. So, you know, you can offer work experience, but it's not essential for all students to do it. And if they do, it's 1 week. But also, the previous government were talking about things of experiences of the workplace rather than work experience. So I think, you know, the Labour government are changing this or looking to change this, aren't they?
Well, yeah, and I think this is where we need to step up, because the real risk here is that we end up back in a position where, you know, job centres, careers advice are trying to do it all themselves. And what we know from loads of work over years is that there are things that job centres and schools and public sector careers advice is good at, and there are things they're not good at. And one of the things they're less good at is actually that process of matching.
Yeah.
So there's something here about the partnership agreement that exists between the REC and its members and the DWP in terms of how we drive real difference. And you know that in Yorkshire, as well as in London, we've been working with Alison McDermott and our team on the Restart programme for the last couple of years, which has now placed over 2,300 people into work from long-term unemployment. And when you look at the stories there, actually the barriers are often not as great as you might think, but they are barriers that the state does not have the capacity or the structures to address, whereas the private sector does. So there's something here about showing us playing our part in tackling particularly unemployment and inactivity amongst young people, but I think more broadly. And there's a sort of an enlightened self-interest here, because we do have a shrinking labour force. We need to build more of it ourselves. But also, as we do that, I think you get more persuasive when you turn around to government and say, actually, the supply here is so short, we need some visas. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, the visa and the immigration situation at the moment, I think, is challenging, and you know, increasing the salary level for people to come and do a skilled job. I don't agree that they should be doing that. I think taking away the dependent visa, again, you know, that wouldn't work for me. I think they need to entice people to come and want to work here. You know, the NHS have cracked it. You know, a lot of the NHS is is run by international workforce. The health and social care sector are, using it, albeit some are exploitative. But again, there are, especially in this area, there's a couple of organisations that are now bringing in employees from overseas to work as carers and things like that because there's a skill shortage within that sector. I think what they need to do is make the process simpler and cheaper for the smaller organisations. So we've got over here at the moment an influx of qualified accountants coming over here to do a master's degree. They get a post-study visa, and they might have worked for KPMG internationally. Their qualification is then transferred over here, so they get the UK equivalent of the ACCA because they're qualified wherever they're from. The problem being is that the accountancy practices over here either don't understand how much knowledge those international workers have and what skills they can bring, or if they do, the accountancy practices then don't have the knowledge and experience to be able to go, I'll do your sponsorship visa. It's not simple, it's not cheap, it's something that's completely different. Yet these workers are coming over here with some fantastic skills and experience, but they can't find work.
So there's a couple of things there. One is about positive engagement with other countries.
Yeah.
And actually, if you think about, and you've already seen this with the approach that's being taken, there's a moment of reset here in our international relations. And it isn't just Brexit, it goes beyond Brexit. I think we got stuck under the previous government with a very transactional view of international relations and a sense that we could just go out and bang the table, and because we're Britain, we'll get what we want. Classic example about kind of trade deal with India. We'd love a trade deal with India, but the first thing on the list is migration.
Yeah.
For them.
Yeah.
The same is true with the United States. No trade deal with the United States, because actually what the United States will require, we might not be willing to sign up to. So there's a whole piece here about what's possible, and things like recognition of professional qualifications. It is hard for governments to do a deal, but it has big upsides.
Yeah.
So these are the kinds of things that maybe we've lacked the patience for since the Brexit referendum. Now, with a bit more stability, a bit more time, I think ministers changing jobs a little less regularly, there's an opportunity to create a world where we do say, actually, those accountants that are coming in, they're coming from this country and they're qualified with this professional body. And we do think, actually, we've talked to the ACCA and the ACCA say this is all right.
Yeah.
So that helps. And then the other thing is just user friendliness in the visa system.
Yeah.
I mean, people who are listening to this will have applied for visas for their companies. It is like admitting to a crime dealing with them sometimes.
Yeah.
And the whole system is designed to be next to impossible for unadvised employers to navigate.
Yeah.
So there's a whole piece here about, yes, it's expensive, and it probably isn't going to get less expensive, but it could be easier at the price point they're charging. And I think there's a lot that we can do with the Home Office on customer service.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest challenge, and it is one of the massive barriers when we have a big skill shortage and there are those people that are willing to work over here with those skills, and then the Home Office are not making it easy or simple or user-friendly. And like you say, it's anything to deter you from doing it, which is very, very frustrating. So, yeah, I agree that there definitely needs to be a lot that needs to be looked at.
Yeah.
I think we've covered a lot there, and I think we're sort of segueing quite nicely into the state of the current market.
Yeah.
So, yes, I think so. One of the things, obviously, that we do with the REC, along with a number of other agencies, is we contribute to your monthly Jobs Outlook report, which is published. We share that quite frequently with our clients. So some of those people listening will have seen some of these reports. Mm-hmm. It's been a challenging market over the last 6 to 9 months. There's been a lot of vacancies slowing down, a lot of hiring slowing down. The June report, which has just come out, was interesting to see that there'd been a slight uptake in April. So things have started moving again in April. And then it slowed again in June. But I think everything is indicative of that being because of the election, isn't it?
Panel was really clear for June report on jobs that it was all about the election. And you could see that in the temp side, which ticked back positive. I think we went through a long period of having quite an odd labour market, in as much as employment didn't move with the economy the way you might expect it to. And there are lots of reasons for that. Companies like to hold on to labour for an upswing, but also I think it's easy to forget the impact that money basically being free for 15 years had, both on companies in terms of being able to sustain credit positions, but actually also on workers. A lot of the pay pressure we're seeing now is because some of the times when there was pay pressure in the early part of the 2010s, for instance, people had a load of interest-free credit cards.
Yeah.
Which allowed greater flexibility of managing household finances, and that has gone now, and that's where we see some of the pay uptick. I think if you look at, therefore, this is a more classical labour market performance. What do we know? We know the labour market lags the economy. We had a recession tail end of last year. We're seeing that washing out in the numbers now. Economies, the growth numbers that came out in early July were really very chunky for the UK. Lots of noise in the data, so it's probably not kind of the implied almost 5% annualized that if you took the monthly figure for May, you might think. But it is an economy that is starting to grow and starting to use up some of the capacity that it has. And what do we know about how labour markets recover? Well, the economy recovers, there's a bit of a wait, and then temp recovers, and then perm recovers.
Yeah.
I think we're starting to see temp recovering now. I think we will see perm start to recover over the summer. It's worth remembering that the permanent market across the UK has actually been slowing for 21 months now. So that's almost 2 years.
Yeah.
So even if you're just a believer in cyclical economics, there is an upswing coming. So for me, I think away from one sector in particular, engineering, which hasn't had a downturn.
Yeah.
Almost every other sector has. IT has had one, as the kind of IT firms particularly affected by the loss of cheap capital for investment and the impact of the cuts made in firms in Silicon Valley. Didn't have a recession in 2020 for obvious reasons, as we were all going online. Has had quite a serious one now. We're starting to see that turn. I think we're starting to see construction turn in the numbers this week. I think you and I have talked before that one of my favourite ersatz measures of the British economy is to watch brick imports, which have been recovering. So there's a whole piece here about potentially we've been through a long slowdown and we're coming into a turn. I'm actually quite positive about 2025 and the rest of this year in the labour market. The medium-term challenge is actually what happens when we use up the capacity that we have, especially if we can't address economic inactivity, but I think we can, where we might generate more pay inflation. And that might hold us back. So we're in for a bit of a bumpy economic rest of the year, because I think we'll recover, but I think inflation will bounce back up a little bit, and then and the indications from the bank are that we're probably only seeing 0.5 percentage point off interest rates this year.
I was going to say, we do know
chunks.
They announced that they would be reducing interest rates, but the election was called, so that obviously couldn't happen at that stage. I think at the AGM that I was at with you earlier on this week, the indicators are that reduction will come, but not necessarily straight away, probably the next time that they review it, which again is going to be a positive, because any businesses that are looking to borrow money or get investment, they will wait for that, albeit it's only going to be a small reduction, but it might be the reduction enough that they need to then move forward with their plans. There's a lot of businesses I've spoken to that want to invest in new tech in the business, especially with AI and things coming in, and they're waiting for that to be able to move forward with those plans. A lot of businesses looking at the R&D to launch new products. So again, that's going to go hand in hand. And then also, investing in headcount, and having that. We always see as you sort of come out of a recession, an investment in accountancy roles to manage your cash flow and an investment in sales roles to bring that money back in. And I'm starting to see things like that coming back as well. So, again, like you say, it's cyclical. Where businesses have restructured probably over the last 6 to 9 months, it's always HR, back office roles, those that aren't generating money or bringing that money in, they don't invest as much in training and development. They tend to, if they're going to recruit, they might try and recruit themselves rather than spending on agency. And we've seen a lot of that in our area over the last 6 months. But I think we still got quite a candidate short market in our area. Yorkshire has always been one of the lowest rates of unemployment in the UK when you look at the ONS statistics, and we still are one of the lowest. And I think where you do have a skilled role, it's very, very difficult to recruit those roles in this region, which is why a lot of organisations do have a need for agencies. But I think because of people trying to control cash flow, you do see those cyclical patterns of, I will try and do it myself.
Yeah.
And then 6 months later, they come back to you because either they haven't done it or the person they hired hasn't worked out.
Yeah, a couple of things there. Firstly, I think we see demand much stronger in the North and Midlands than we do in London and the South at the moment, which I think is about sectoral mix rather than anything else, and about tightness of labour markets. So there's a piece here about understanding where we are in the cycle and clients understanding where we are. Because one of the things that slightly depresses me is when businesses regard kind of people, things as back office cuttable stuff.
Yeah.
By definition, productivity is the difference maker in an economy. Yep. I mean, I spent some time yesterday talking with a group of business leaders about staff engagement, and we know companies with engaged staff have significantly better performance. So there's a whole piece here about how do we do the people stuff well as employers that I think is worthy of attention, even before we get to the point that we have a super tight labour market and you need to attract the right people. That's why the REC's work on Aim Higher, which KD kindly contributed to, is about having that discussion with employers around what does good look like in this market, because it doesn't look like something that is more transactional. It is something that's more relationship based, more based on your value as an employer, what you're trying to achieve over the long haul. Because actually, even though there's been a recession, this is not what classically we'd call a client's market. No. Because supply is so constrained. So for us as recruiters, we're talking about finding our clients and understanding their problems now. But when we understand their problems, the solutions to those problems are more complex and different. And I'm not sure that many clients have the kind of frameworks in place to think about how to solve that within their own business. This is where kind of there's a big role for our industry to play.
And I think you're right. Because obviously we've been speaking for quite a while before the Aim Higher Guide came out about, well, what does good recruitment look like? And actually, it's not just about the recruitment, and it's not a transactional thing anymore. It is becoming more of a partner with an organisation, and it is looking at understanding their culture, understanding their values, understanding what their challenges are economically and with their people, and focusing on people for growth. So it's something that we've done since I started the business 7 years ago. Is we're not just recruiters, we are partnering with you, and we're an extension of your organisation, and we understand everything about your business so that when you do recruit, we're in a position to find you the best talent. Now, part of that is looking at economics and what's going on in the labour market. Part of that is talking to them about salary benchmarking. Part of that is, in the current climate, looking at workforce planning. And, if you have had to pause it or you are looking at restructuring, well, what does that look like? And there's a few organisations that we've been talking to about outplacement support due to restructures, but actually exiting those people in a positive way rather than it being a negative. When I was approached by the REC to do a case study for the Aim Higher Guide, it was important for me to kind of showcase the going above and beyond that we do for our clients. Recruiting for a position is only a small part of what we do. I think in the current climate, and I think the future of recruitment is going to be more like that.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
And I think if you think about kind of where we're going, I think some of the options that clients have now aren't necessarily classic recruitment options. There are different players coming into this market. And what kind of concerns me is actually you're getting a lot of, for instance, consultancy businesses getting involved in staffing solutioning. And recruiters are the experts in this stuff.
Yeah.
And we talk a lot, don't we, about believing in our own professionalism and believing in selling a high value product to local businesses, because that's what makes the difference to those businesses' growth and to opening up people's opportunities. And I think it's really important that we do talk about opportunities for people as well, because one of the things we're trying to do at the moment, and I know you're helping us out with this, Kelly, is tell stories about why people work flexibly.
Yes.
Just really get that point across to policymakers that the world is different to their preconception if you believe kind of think tanks that all operate within 1 square mile of Whitehall and Westminster. That storytelling is going to be incredibly important to protecting people from a kind of a slightly nanny state view of what work should be. And the more of that we can do, the better the regulation becomes, the better the industrial strategy becomes, the more opportunity we open up and the higher growth companies have. That piece around really getting the new government to understand the reality of work is what gave rise to the most geekish thing in the REC Manifesto, which was have a workplace employment relations study. And if you go on the government website, WERS is the gold standard, described by the government as the gold standard of our understanding of the workplace. It was last done in 2011.
Yeah.
And actually, every time we do WERS, we discover some things. And the things we discover, I'm pleased to say, the trade unions don't often much like, which is most people like their employer. Most people enjoy their job. Most people feel that they have some voice at work. And most people have a clear view of how they want their workplace to change. And it's not necessarily in the way that those think tanks within a square mile of Whitehall and Westminster think. So I think there's something here about our role as recruiters and with clients and with the people we place, telling a story to the centre about what life's really like, which I think there's an opportunity to do with a change of government. And that's why the REC's Voice of Workers stuff that will come out in time for this year's this year's party conferences is going to be really important. It was, of course, going to be our big last play before an October general or November general election, but Rishi beat us to it.
I know. And I think, to be fair, though, when you released your manifesto at the beginning of the year, a lot of the information that was in there actually is kind of part of the new government's kind of manifesto as well. But the Voice of the Worker campaign that you're working on at the moment, I think it's going to be really important to show the government that flexible work works for both sides, and it's not just employers going, I need temps. I have a number of what I call professional temporary workers who only temp because of various different reasons. I've got one lady who has a daughter in America, and she temps for however long that contract is, earns money, flies to America, spends a few months with her daughter, comes back, gets another temp job. Might be 3 weeks, it might be 3 months, but she'll commit to the whole temp contract and then she flies back again. And she literally tempts to earn the money to go back to America. And she'd done it for years and years. And that works amazing for her because she can't get those holidays in a permanent contract, in a permanent job, and she'd never see a daughter. So, temping works brilliantly for her.
Yeah, and it's making those stories really front and center and helping people understand, the choices people make in their lives. And it is linked to the industrial strategy piece. One of the things that I think was a big opportunity with this government to do is to get across to people that labour market policy doesn't exist in a vacuum. So we talk about inactivity as a problem. Why is it a problem? It's a problem because inactivity is made up of people on NHS waiting lists. It's made up of parents who've traded out of the labour market because there isn't available affordable childcare. It's made up of people who aren't working because they can't get to workplaces because the local bus services have been cut back. And speaking as someone who's tried to take a local bus in the Vale of York, I know what that is like. So there's a whole kind of piece here about how we get government policy aligned behind activation. And I think actually probably the most positive thing I've seen from this government in its first sort of 10 days or so is Liz Kendall's acknowledgement that those things also matter to our labour force. Everything is down to enabling people to make decisions that are positive for them and for their businesses day to day. And so that people experience the government as an enabler of investment, as an enabler of opportunity, as an enabler of growth in their business. And if that starts to happen, then the potential is enormous. I genuinely, I'm not sure whether I've got any kind of theoretical base for this. I'm quite optimistic about the British economy now. And it's not fashionable post-Brexit to be that way. But I've always regarded Brexit as it's a bit like having a chronic injury rather than a critical illness, right? It's something we've got to live with.
Yeah.
But it's perfectly livable with. Actually, think about the UK. It's got stable government, boring politics again. Rule of law is solid. It's got good financial systems. It's got a highly skilled workforce. It's the kind of place you send things to be done well in manufacturing and in creatives. So there's lots of strengths there. Now compare and contrast us to some of our competitors right now.
Well, I was just about to say, compared to what's going on in America, France and Germany, we're in a better position than they are, and we are a stronger country economically for that, I think.
Yeah, and none of that is about kind of Brexit.
No.
I mean, Brexit's neither here nor there. It's about the fundamentals of the British economy. So, yes, it's been really tough for a couple of years, and I think particularly in the people side, but I think there is a bit of kind of potential underlying momentum here. And if the honourable member for Richmond and Northallerton did us any favours at all, I think probably getting the election out of the way in July. The bank will cut rates in August. They should do it in July, but they won't. They'll do it when they publish their MPC, their monetary policy report in August. That will start to get things going. Inflation will bounce around, but it won't get back up anywhere near where it was. And to your point about companies and maybe hovering over the button for a little while, starting to press that. And what we know about smaller businesses is, one shouldn't say this as an economist, but a lot of the economy is about vibes.
Yeah.
It's about how people
follow.
are thinking. Yeah, absolutely. So we stopped hiring 18 months ago because a big firm up the road stopped hiring, and what do they know that I don't know? And the same will happen.
I've said
in reverse.
to loads of people over the last few weeks. It's like the British queuing system. And you join a queue and you go, what are you queuing for? And they're like, I don't know, but there's a queue, so I feel like I should join it. Yeah. And I feel like that's what's happened. You had the bigger organisations who were pausing because they had to wait for, should we invest? Should we wait for inflation to come round? And then the smaller businesses sat there and went, well, if you've stopped, we'll stop. And they say, why have you stopped? And you go, well, because they have. And
you can invest against certainty. It doesn't actually matter how good or bad the certainty is. You can invest against certainty. It's lost in the morass of COVID. But the REC's report on jobs for January and February 2020 are unspeakably positive because of the 2019 general election, whereas everyone just went, right, this is what it is. It's Boris for 5 years. This is what Brexit looks like. Let's go.
Yeah.
And I think we'll get exactly the same this time, which is, right, we know where we stand. It's a Starmer for 5 years and looking at the result, possibly 10 years. We know what that looks like. Let's invest against that.
Yeah.
And my kind of the flippant way of saying this is if there's money in the world economy that's always there to invest.
Yeah.
And if you're running from a tiger, you don't need to be first, just need not to be last. And we're
Absolutely.
very defiantly not last. Actually, one of the interesting things about where we are now and the growth figures in early July for May is Labour made this big commitment of being the fastest growing economy in the G7. They might do it in year one, and they might do it in year one with growth that was generated when they weren't in government.
Yeah. They're going to ride on them coattails, aren't they?
Well, absolutely. So, and for Sunak, it was always the trade-off. The economy was improving, things were getting better, but there's the prisons crisis, there's the small boats crisis, a load of stuff coming down the track that feels less positive. I do think that the chances of Rachel Reeves being a lucky chancellor are quite high.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think the thing is, we all know that Keir Starmer's never going to reinvent the wheel. So I think, knowing the type of politician that he is and his background, is that in itself gives stability. We kind of understand him as a person and kind of how he's going to run his government. So I think that will definitely give stability. And I think because of everything that's happened over the last 4 years with the pandemic and every Tom, Dick and Harry becoming Prime Minister and trying it for a bit, I think we need that. And I'm like you. I feel a lot more positive about how we're going to start 2025. I think it's like a ship turning. It's going to be a slow turn for the next 6 months, but it is turning. And I think the start of 2025 is going to be a lot more positive and probably a bit more in line with 2019. And that's that levelling out that we've been doing. It's like a bouncy ball. It starts off quite big and then it gets smaller and smaller until it sort of rolls. And I think that's kind of, we're coming to that roll, aren't we?
Yeah, and then the big question is what happens after the honeymoon period for the government's over and what the opposition begins to look like. Because the other thing, just to close off on the election, the other thing is we don't really know what the future of the Conservative Party is right now.
No.
And clearly we've got a big bunch of Lib Dems in Parliament. We've got a much smaller, though you wouldn't know it from the national media, bunch of Reform MPs, Greens and so forth. They've much more pluralist Parliament. And the Conservatives have got a big decision to make, which is, are you going to focus on winning back 14% of the electorate from Reform and winning 5 seats, or winning a tiny percent of the electorate in 60 seats in the south of England that you've lost to the Liberal Democrats? And I suspect that the answer for business is pay the Conservatives some attention when we get to about the middle of 2026, because they'll all sorted out what they think by then. Yeah,
no, I agree. And like you say, it's the post-honeymoon period of them deciding what happens next. Yeah,
absolutely.
I feel like we could talk about this for hours. It's definitely been a hot topic for the last few weeks. I'm glad we're through the election. We can all breathe and start refocusing on our plans for the rest of this year going into next year. And I think both you and I agree that it's going to be a lot more positive. And, the work that the REC are doing with the Voice of the Worker campaign, it's going to be interesting for me to be able to share that with our clients later on this year, and obviously hear what government think about that report as well. So that's going to be good. I have shared with a lot of our clients already the Aim Higher Guide, but if anybody listening or watching wants a copy of that, you can get in touch with us through the website, or you can email me or give me a call. But it just takes me to say thank you so much, Neil, for your time. It's been insightful, really interesting. And I think we all need to kind of watch this space and get through summer, don't we?
Yeah, get through summer, and also remind our new MPs and our new government that they have big economic and prosperity goals, but only business can deliver them. And so just being a bit proud of that and the role we play feels really important.
Yeah, no, definitely. So for anybody listening and watching, don't forget to subscribe for future episodes, and I will look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Thanks very much, Neil.
Thank you.